The International Monetary Fund is perhaps one of the most controversial entities on Earth. It is undoubtedly one of the most powerful and is one of those responsible in some cases of economic and financial crises that have left some countries on the verge of bankruptcy. But where did this controversial organization come from? And what are the roots of its great political and economic influence? In cases such as Argentina and Greece, for example, that without the billion-dollar disbursement by the IMF, Greece would have had to leave the Eurozone, and Argentina, with the current Macri, it would not have cash to pay the current and national debts. The IMF is present at various meetings of international importance, such as the G20, where between the European Union and IMF are the only two entities that are not countries attending the annual meeting of the most industrialized nations on the planet. So what are their functions and what role do they play, and why are their policies so necessary but so unpopular at the same time? After the end of the Second World War, with the collapsed financial system and general disorder, it was established that an organization that regulated international trade was necessary. From there, the International Monetary Fund was born at the Bretton Woods Conference with its sister organization, the World Bank. The IMF is the public organization that lends the most money in the world. Membership is open to any of the 186 states of the United Nations, the same states that direct the organization. Almost all nations in the world are part of the IMF. Rare exceptions include Cuba and North Korea. There are even non-UN member nations such as Hong Kong or Taiwan, as they were expelled from the UN and replaced by the People's Republic of China. The IMF itself is responsible for maintaining order of the international financial system, which is not a simple task. Each country has its own peculiarities, and the IMF tries to recommend certain macroeconomic adjustments that sometimes do not always please the government in question. In many cases, these adjustments or reforms include liberalizing the economy and reducing the size of the states, and also increasing taxes and putting down barriers of protectionism, and then being able to opt for financing from the IMF. Some believe that the IMF is simply a tool of the United States government to subdue and manipulate financially dependent countries, and that it is an arm over foreign economic policy for America. But to what extent are these claims true? The truth is that the IMF, like the United Nations, is an international organization and is funded by the 186 countries that make it up. Each country must pay a fee based on the size of its economy. The larger its economy, then obviously the greater weight the country will have in shaping the organization and the policies it implements. The larger the country is, the greater its contribution. So for example, the US makes up around 18% of the total quota, while the Seychelles contribute a modest 0.004%. From the IMF website, it states that quotas are a key factor in the decision-making power of the IMF. For example, China, the world's second largest economy, does not contribute what it should have to contribute to the IMF, with 6% of the global quota. Japan provides the same amount as China, with China having a much larger economy. The US, France, Germany, Japan, the United Kingdom, and Italy contribute to more than 25% of the IMF quota. Meanwhile, Russia, China, and India together do not even reach 10% of the IMF quota. In total, the IMF owns about $300 billion in installments and about $50 billion for immediate loans. Obviously, the IMF being an international organization with control mechanisms and a strong Western presence, there are certain conditions that countries with authoritarian models or anti-American sentiments do not agree with so much. In cases of financial or economic crises caused by poor economic management, the IMF can help, but it has its conditions. In exchange for the IMF aid, it generally requires the given country to embark on a reform economy program supervised by the entity. This is also known as structural adjustment policies. These policies, depending on the severity of the state of the economy, may include strong privatizations of public companies or state-owned companies and increased taxes to adjust fiscal deficits. In the case of much poorer countries, the IMF can offer loans at a 0% interest, with extensions ranging from 4, 8, and 12 years, all depending on the type of loan or the financial rescue that the country needs. So let's take a look of some of the most iconic IMF bailouts and which had the biggest repercussions. 1997, South Korea. The Asian economic crisis of the late 90s hit South Korea heavily. With the collapse of the currency and the abundance of bankruptcies, South Korea went to the IMF for help and the World Bank. The aid totaled to around $75 billion. The US, Japan, and 11 other countries also contributed to these funds. In exchange, the South Korean government had to endure difficult conditions, including high interest rates and many reforms to open the country's then closed economy. They also had to suppress the relationships between banks and large conglomerates. 1997 and 1998, Indonesia. Shaken by the Asian financial crisis, Indonesia was the site of one of the biggest IMF bailouts ever. The country's currency, the Indonesian rupiah, had been falling steadily since August 1997, with inflation rising to almost 80%. In addition to the consequent political turmoil and the protests, the capital city Jakarta was paralyzed under the president-dictator Suharto, that had been in power since 1968. After the financial rescue, Indonesia's economic problems continued for several years, and resentment grew towards the IMF policies in the 90s, which some considered to be an infringement of the country's economic sovereignty. Macroeconomic conditions had finally improved, helped by the resolution of the East Timor crisis, and in 2006 and 2007, USACIA rated the country's stock market as one of the 3 best in the world. The loan to Indonesia during the crisis totaled between $58 and $64 billion. 1998 to 2002, Brazil. The first Brazil bailout in 1998 came immediately after a financial crisis in Asia and Russia and caused panic among investors in Latin America. On this occasion, the IMF and a number of other lenders promised to avoid the crisis before it hit. Brazil, the largest economy in South America, received an aid package to stabilize the region, and in return, Brazil was asked to cut spending and increase taxes to avoid a budget deficit. The Brazilian Congress rejected the conditions, but the loans continued anyway. The lenders intervened again in the name of stability in 2001, since Brazil's currency was devalued by 20% between January and August and public debt grew. The 2002 elections raised even more concerns, as investors were not sure how the leftist candidate Lula da Silva could handle the crisis. Brazil's stock market fell further when the then Secretary of the US Treasury, Paul O'Neill, demanded evidence that another loan would not leave the country and into Swiss bank accounts. Furious, Brazil demanded an apology, and shortly thereafter, the US and the IMF offered the country a $30 million care package. World leaders have demonized the IMF, such as former Venezuelan President Hugo Chavez, Bolivian President Evo Morales, and former Ecuadorian President Rafael Correa, indicating that accessing IMF loans was to renounce national sovereignty and submit to Washington, D.C. There are many new ways of obtaining credit at an international level, which no longer go through macroeconomic recommendations or forced adjustments by entities such as the World Bank or the International Monetary Fund. In many cases, however, some countries that do not wish to accept the conditions set by the IMF, such as tax adjustments, democratization, and tax increases, have to go to other creditors that work within their conditions. The IMF and the World Bank generally agree to lend to countries that are following the USA's alignments. But this is not always the case. But now, there is a country that has been acting as an entity like the World Bank, lending billions of dollars to multiple countries and regions all around the world. The country in question? China. It is now the country that lends the most money in the world. Its loan conditions are peculiar, even borderline enslaving in some cases. But that's for another video, where we'll discuss how China has managed to exercise an instrument of control and power through debt. So I pass the question off to you. Do you think the IMF is a good option for countries going through economic difficulties? What adjustments would be difficult to implement but necessary? And what about the IMF is ineffective? Let us know your thoughts in the comments below. And don't forget to like and subscribe for more videos like this every single week.